breiten Faust an Lanzenschaft, die Zügel in der Linken, so springt des Reiches Ritterschaft und ihre Schwerter blinken. Heya, 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 und ihre Schwerter blinken. Heya, 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 und ihre Schwerter blinken.
Hello and welcome to Lex Arundi, Lex Credendi. I'm Kenny, and today I'm doing I'm going to attempt, this is a fairly long deal. There's a book written by Father Martin von Cochem, who was, of course, born in 1625 and died in 1712. So, given the time period, this is a very reliable book. It's from catholictradition.org, and Father's entire title is Father Martin von Cochem, O.S.F.C. And at the moment, I cannot remember what O.S.F.C. stands for. Order of something. I no idea. Anyway, but moving on. So, part 1 on death. On the terror of death. It appears to me unnecessary to say much about the terrors of death. The subject has been sufficiently enlarged upon by various writers. Besides, everyone knows and feels for himself that life is sweet and death is bitter. However old a man may be, however broken in health, however miserable in his circumstances, the thought of death is an unwelcome one. There are 3 principal reasons why all sensible people fear death so much. First, because the love of life, the dread of death, is inherent in human nature. Secondly, because every rational being is well aware that death is bitter, and the separation of soul and body cannot take place without inexpressible suffering. Thirdly, because no one knows whither he will go after death, or how he will stand in the day of judgment. That's one that I think is the main reason why people fear death. I mean, even people that don't believe in that stuff, deep in their being, they do actually fear death. And that's a good reason to fear death, which is why you're supposed to work out your salvation in fear and trembling. It will be well to explain the second and third of these reasons rather more fully, in order, on the one hand, that those who lead a careless life may perhaps be awakened, thereby to a fear of death, learn to avoid sin, and on the other, that each one of us may be warned to prepare for death, lest we be overtaken by it unawares. Everyone shrinks instinctively from death, because it is bitter and painful beyond description to human nature. The soul of man is subject to many anxieties, apprehensions, and sorrows, and the body is subject to pain and sickness and all kinds. Yet none of these pains can be compared to the agony of death. A man who loses his good name and his prosperity feels acute grief, but he does not die of it. All suffering and sickness all grief and anguish, however terrible, is less bitter than death. Hence we see death to be a mighty monarch, the most cruel and most relentless, the most formidable enemy of mankind. Look at a man wrestling with death, and you will see how the tyrant overpowers, disfigures, prostrates his victim. Now, why is death so hard, so terrible a thing? It is because the soul has to separate itself from the body. The body and soul were created for each other, and so and so and so intimate is their union that a parting between them seems almost impossible. They would endure almost anything rather than to be torn asunder. The soul is fearful of the future and of the unknown land to which she is going. The body is conscious that as soon as the soul departs from it, it will become the prey of worms. Consequently, the soul cannot bear to leave the body, nor the body part from the soul. Body and soul desire their union to remain unbroken together, enjoy the sweets of life. In one of his epistles to St. Augustine, St. Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, relates that what was told him by a man who had been raised from the dead, amongst other things, he said, "The moment when my soul left my body was one of such awful pain and distress that no one can imagine the anguish I then endured. If all conceivable sufferings and pain were put together, they would be as nothing in comparison with the torture I underwent at the separation of the soul and body." And to emphasize his words, he added, addressing St. Cyril, "Thou knowest that thou hast a soul, but thou knowest not what it is. Thou knowest that beings exist called angels, but thou art ignorant of their nature. Thou knowest also that there is God, but thou canst not comprehend his being. So is it with everything that has not corporal shape or understanding cannot grasp these things. In like manner, it is impossible for thee to understand how I could suffer such intense agony in one short moment. And if some people apparently pass away most peacefully, this is because nature, exhausted by suffering, has no longer the force to struggle with death. We know from the testimony of our Redeemer himself that no agony is like the agony of death, although throughout the whole course of his sorrowful passion, he was tortured in a terrible manner. Yet all the martyrdom he endured was not to be compared with what he suffered at the moment of his death. This we gather from the Gospels. Nowhere do we find, at any period of his life, the greatness of the pains he bore extorted from our Lord a cry of anguish. But when the moment came for him to expire, and the ruthless hand of death rent his heart asunder, we read that he cried out with a loud voice and gave up the ghost. Hence, it is evident that at no period of the Passion did Christ suffer so acutely as the most painful separation of his sacred soul from his blessed body. In order that mankind might, at least in some measure, understand how terrible was the death Christ died for us, he ordained that we, at our dissolution, should taste something of the bitterness of his death and experience the truth of the following words of Pope St. Gregory. Christ's conflict with death represented our last conflict, teaching us that the agony of death is the keenest agony that man has ever felt or will ever feel. It is the will of God that man should suffer so intensely at the close of his life in order that we may recognize and appreciate the magnitude of Christ's love for us, the inestimable benefit he has conferred on us by enduring death for our sake. For it would have been impossible for man fully to know the infinite love of God unless he too had drank to some extent the bitter chalice which Christ drank. In this passage from the writings of the Holy Pope Gregory, we are taught that Christ ordained that all men in the hour of their dissolution should suffer the like pains which Christ suffered for us in his last agony, in order that they may gain some knowledge by their own experience of the terrible nature of death he endured for us and the great price he paid for our ransom. How painful, how terrible, how awful death will be for us if our death is in any degree to resemble Christ's most agonizing death. How severe a conflict is before us poor mortals. What torments await us at our last hour? One is most inclined to think it would have been preferable never to have been born than to be born to suffer such anguish. But is thus that heaven is to be won, and through this through this narrow gate alone can we enter into paradise. Wherefore, O Christian, accept your destiny cheerfully, and form a steadfast resolution to bear unmurmuringly the bitterness of death. For it is a great merit to yield up one's life, the life every man loves so well, and submit with a ready and willing mind the pains of death. And for the purpose of encouraging you to gain merit in your last moments, let me counsel you to make the following determination to suffer death bravely. And today, nobody suffers death bravely. Like, we are terrified of death. We shut down the entire world because we were so scared of death, because we had no courage. We were all effeminate. And even though people like myself and others may not have been afraid at all, and we were just irritated by the whole thing, like, just let us live our lives. We don't care if it gets us, it gets us. People, they want to hang on to the pleasures of this life. They don't think about death until they're threatened by it. And then when it comes, everybody's scared of it. Or what has been happening lately is, since we live in a culture of death, you end up with people who have no comprehension of what death actually is. They just think that death is just the end, no more suffering, I'm out. This is why you have, I'm trying to think of how to say this without getting in trouble on YouTube. Anyway, this is why you have that, air quotes, end of life care, where you can basically choose to go instead of just letting yourself go when God calls you. Because your life is in God's hands and nobody else's. It's not in my hands. It's not in your hands. It is in God's hands. And when you treat death in one of two directions, either you see death as a way out, like a lot of people do nowadays, or you look at death as just like something to be avoided. You're seeking like some sort of immortality in this world. We're not meant to stay in this world forever because of original sin. And so death is that, as what I just read said, the narrow gate which leads to salvation if you die in a state of grace. That's the key point. And I may actually try to look up some stuff on the fewness of the saved for that reason, because one of the things that and the further along I read on this, it'll probably mention it, but you know, death is always going to be horrible, but for those who are saved, which are going to be few, uh, it, death will be a bittersweet thing. But for those who are not going to be saved, for those who are outside of the Catholic Church, for those who have lived the Catholic life, but in a constant state of mortal sin, like they're not even trying. Like, I have my struggles, you have your struggles, and we're supposed to struggle through those things. And by the end of our life, we have to have managed to stay in a state of grace. If you haven't already, you got to get there. If you are there, you got to stay there. And so death is a very beautiful yet horrific thing for somebody who is, preparing him or herself to go see the Lord. All right. But actually, one more thing before I do the because there's a little resolution at the end of this page here. So, death will be horrible for all of these people, whether it's because they died in a state of mortal sin, or whether it is because they decided to check out on their own. Death will be horrible for them. And, they're going to go from one moment getting out of their sufferings or agonizing as they're dying, one of the two. And then they're going to go before the judgment seat of God, and it's too late for them, which is why you got to pray for everybody as they're dying. Like, even if they're not in the church, pray for them, because you don't know what God may do in their last moments to try to bring them into the church. So anyway, on to the resolution here. O God of all justice, who hast ordained that since the fall of our first parents all men should die, and also that it should be the lot of many amongst us to taste in their death something of the pains of thy Son endured at the hour of his death, I submit most willingly to this thy stern decree, although life is sweet to me and death appears most bitter. Yet out of obedience to thee, I voluntarily accept death with all the pains, and am ready to yield up my soul whenever, wherever, in what way or manner whatsoever it may please thy divine providence to appoint, to appoint. And since thou hast made death so bitter to man, in order that we may feel to a certain extent by our own experience how painful a death thy beloved Son underwent for our sakes, I willingly accept the penalties of death, that I may at least in my latter end now know something of the pains of my blessed Lord, which he suffered on my account. In honor, therefore, of his bitter passion and death, I now cheerfully subject myself to whatever sufferings I may be called upon to pass through at the moment of my departure, and declare my determination to bear them with the constancy of which I am capable. I pray that this resolution on my part may be pleasing in thy sight, and that thou wilt give me grace to bear my last agony with patience. Amen. All right, well, I have said most of what I need to say on that, because and I will be continuing with this. Hopefully I'll get this whole thing done before Easter. I mean, it doesn't look like it's that bad. If I just do one every day, I should be able to get through it. But the next one that I'll be doing is it's on the assaults of Satan at the hour of death. So I will save that for the next time. And everybody, pray your rosaries, get your brown scapulars, get enrolled if you haven't, if you can. I know sometimes priests will give you a hard time if they don't, if they're not promoting it. But anyway, until next time, Deus Vult.